Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on a true heavyweight of human history.
We really are.
We're discussing an invention that historians, they frequently rank it as one of the most influential events of the entire second millennium.
An engine of change.
Yes, an engine of change so profound it literally reset the operating system of Western civilization. We are diving deep into Johannes Gutenberg's movable type printing press.
That ranking is, I think, absolutely justified, and frankly, it might even be an understatement.
Really?
Oh, yeah. We are talking about the foundation of mass communication itself. If you think about every revolution that followed, religious, scientific, political, they all required the ability to share complex, identical information rapidly across huge distances.
So our mission today is to unpack not just the genius of the technology itself back in the 15th century, but the true magnitude of the transformation that started in Mainz around 1440.
Exactly.
Let's start with the sheer mechanics, because understanding the simplicity of the machine is kind of key to understanding the profundity of what it could do. It really is.
At its core, the printing press is a mechanical device. It's designed to apply pressure to an inked surface that's resting on something like paper or cloth, and that's how it transfers the ink.
Right, and the earlier printing methods, like woodblocks, they required the printer to brush or rub the back of the paper by hand to get that ink transfer. It was a slow, painstaking process.
The brilliance of Gutenberg, then, wasn't inventing the idea of printing.
No, not at all. It was inventing the mechanical system that made printing fast and accurate enough to matter on a global scale.
And the contrast in speed, that's where the story really is. It's the quantifiable leap that tells you everything.
It's staggering. Before Gutenberg, texts were primarily hand-copied by scribes. You might get just a few pages done in a day. If you were doing manual woodblock printing, maybe on a really good day, you'd hit 40 pages.
40 pages, okay. Versus, what could a single Gutenberg-style press actually manage?
Well, once it was up and running with a skilled two-person crew, a single setup could produce up to 3,600 pages per workday.
3,600. 3,600. And that's based on, an average working day and all the human movements required. That is productivity that leaps from just artisanal labor straight into something that looks a lot like industrial output, almost overnight.
And that shift is what broke the monopoly of the literate elite. So our goal for this deep dive is to see how this invention synthesized existing knowledge, what specific technical bits Gutenberg perfected that others had missed,
and how that perfection acted as a fundamental engine for societal, cultural, and political transformation across Europe and eventually the entire globe.
So prepare for a deep dive that looks at physics, finance, and philosophy.
The first question we have to tackle is context. I mean, if Gutenberg invented this system in 1440, why did it happen then, and why did it happen there in a relatively small city like Mainz?
It was a perfect storm, really.
It was a perfect storm of social and economic pressures. The climate was just incredibly favorable.
We hear a lot about the Renaissance, humanism, all that, but the economic side of things is often overlooked. Let's talk about the economic context. The rise of the merchant class, emerging capitalism.
This is so crucial. Late medieval society was experiencing really rapid economic development. You had this burgeoning merchant class accumulating wealth, and with that wealth came an aspiration for education, for status, things that were previously just for the nobility or the clergy.
Right.
So this emerging capitalist spirit, it fostered entrepreneurial thinking. People were actively looking for better, faster ways to produce goods, and that included intellectual goods. Gutenberg himself was operating very much as an entrepreneur. He was looking for a financial advantage.
And that search for an advantage introduces a really important complication right at the start. Risk and funding. He didn't do this alone, did he?
Not at all. The entire venture was extremely capital intensive. You needed specialized tools, you needed metal, you needed years of secret experimentation.
So you needed backers.
You needed financial backing. Gutenberg famously entered into agreements with financiers, most notably a man named Johann Fust, who was a wealthy goldsmith from Mainz. Fust gave him a substantial loan specifically to fund the experimental phase and build all the necessary tools.
So the economic climate didn't just create the demand, it provided the venture capital for a risky long-term project.
Precisely. It was a classic supply-side opportunity meeting a massive demand-side problem.
And the cultural context was just as important.
Just as vital. There was a sharp rise in medieval learning and literacy, especially among that educated, aspiring middle class, your lawyers, doctors, merchants. They needed legal texts, practical guides, devotional materials, even popular literature. The market was massive, and it was desperate.
And hand copying just couldn't keep up.
Not even close. The system was crying out for a scalable solution.
And it's important to acknowledge, as our sources point out, that Gutenberg was a brilliant synthesizer. He wasn't creating everything from scratch.
That's right. He successfully combined what you could call far-flung strands of existing technology into one complete commercially viable system.
Which brings us to the foundational tech, the press itself. It relied on a machine that had been around for over 1,000 years.
The screw press.
Yeah.
This device, it uses a threaded mechanism to apply direct, concentrated pressure. It was ancient. The Romans introduced it in the 1st century AD.
And it was everywhere because it was essential for daily life.
Yes. It was standard agricultural technology. It was used all across Europe for pressing grapes for wine, olives for oil. So the technology was robust. It was well understood. It was everywhere. Gutenberg didn't need to invent the machine that delivered the pressure.
He just had to adapt it.
He just adapted it.
But adapting a grape press to print tiny, precise letters seems like a massive leap. What was the core mechanical challenge he had to solve there?
Well, the difference is in the type of pressure you need. For wine or oil, you need a slow, sustained, crushing force. For printing, you need a powerful, perfectly even and sudden pressure, what printers often called the kiss. It presses the paper against the type and then immediately releases.
If it's too slow, the ink would smear.
It squishes and smears. If it's uneven, some areas just won't print. So Gutenberg adapted the construction, probably inspired by paper presses, to make sure the pressure was distributed perfectly and applied with the speed and elasticity you needed for a clean transfer.
That distinction-crushing force versus the kiss, that explains the mechanical innovation. Okay, let's move to the most crucial component, the movable type itself. The concept of reusable individual characters had been around for centuries, globally speaking.
Absolutely. We have to give credit where it's due here. The first movable type was actually invented by a Chinese engineer, Bi Sheng, way back in the 11th century, and he used baked clay.
And then in Korea?
In Korea, we see the oldest surviving book printed using metal movable type, the Jikji, and that dates back to 1377.
So the idea was there, the material was there. Why didn't those earlier innovations trigger a global knowledge revolution? Why did Europe have to wait another 70 years?
This is a really critical point. There are two main reasons. First, the Chinese writing system, being logographic, it requires thousands of different characters. Bi Sheng's invention was brilliant, but it was just highly inefficient to manage tens of thousands of individual pieces of type.
Okay, and the second reason?
Well, regarding the Korean metal type, while the concept was sound, the production methods, imprinting or punching, they just lacked the refinement needed for mass application. And critically, in many of these earlier systems, the printing was often still done manually by rubbing the back of the paper.
Which keeps you in that low volume, 40 pages a day range.
Exactly. Gutenberg's genius was integrating and perfecting all the components needed for true mechanical efficiency, from creating the type to applying the pressure.
And two other massive technological factors were already in place in Europe that made this possible: the book format and the raw material.
Right. The book format had been standardized for almost 1,000 years. The codex, folded pages bound at the spine. It replaced the ancient scroll way back around 500 AD.
And it was just better.
Incredibly superior, easier to read, easier to store, and crucially, it allowed printing on both sides of the sheet, the recto and verso. That saved a massive amount of materials. The format was ready for mass production.
The material that the press would crush against, paper. Paper was indispensable.
Paper was the economic multiplier. The success of medieval paper makers and mechanizing paper manufacture using water-powered paper mills was absolutely key.
And crucially, it reduced the price.
Drastically. Once it was mechanized, paper fell to 1/6 the price of expensive parchment, which is made from animal skin. Without cheap, abundant paper, the idea of printing 20 million volumes by 1500 would have been economically impossible.
So by 1440, you have the funding, the demand, the mechanical blueprint of the screw press, the convenient codex format, and cheap paper. All Gutenberg had to do was fill that crucial technical gap.
And that's where his background as a goldsmith comes in. This is where we see his real genius. He didn't just see printing as one job. He saw it as an industrialized process.
Right. He separated typesetting and printing into two separate optimized steps.
He treated the production of text like the minting of coins. It demanded total precision.
His specific training was everything, wasn't it? If he had been a carpenter, he could have built the press, but he wouldn't have had the metallurgy skills to solve the type problem.
Exactly. The primary innovation wasn't the press structure, it was the type and the rapid, standardized way he made it. Gutenberg was the first to create durable, high-quality type from a very specific alloy.
It wasn't just lead. That would have been too soft. It would deform under pressure.
No, it was a precise tripartite alloy. Lead, tin, and antimony. And this combination was so perfect for printing that, remarkably, the alloy is still used today for some applications.
Why those three metals? What did each one do?
Well, lead provided the bulk and the low melting temperature. Tin was added to lower the melting point even more and improve the flow of the liquid metal, making sure it filled every nook and cranny of the mold. But the really innovative part was antimony.
Antimony.
Antimony is one of the few elements that, when it solidifies, actually expands slightly.
So instead of shrinking away from the edges of the mold, which would ruin the precision.
It pushed outward against the mold walls, and that ensured the type came out with perfectly sharp edges and corners, which is non-negotiable if you want crisp, clear letters.
The alloy solved the durability problem, but you still need to make hundreds, thousands of identical pieces of type quickly.
And that's where his most ingenious invention comes in. The special hand mold, or the matrix. This adjustable two-part metallic device was the true secret to the revolution. It allowed for the quick, non-destructive mass production of uniform metal letters.
We have to walk through the mechanics of that. What did the compositor do?
Okay, so the compositor would engrave a letter into the end of a steel punch. This punch was then hammered into a softer copper bar, creating a perfect reverse impression. That's the matrix, the master template.
And that matrix was placed in the bottom of the hand mold.
Exactly. Then the molten lead-tin antimony alloy was poured into the top. Once it cooled, which was very quick, the compositor could rapidly release a brand new, perfect piece of type.
And the mold itself was adjustable.
Crucially, yes. It could be adjusted for a wide W versus a narrow I, while making sure the most important element, the height, was always exactly identical. Without that, the pages would be uneven, and the press would just destroy the type.
So the alloy solved durability, and the hand mold solved scalability and precision.
Correct. And you also have to consider the incredible practical advantage he had working with the Latin alphabet.
Right, compared to the thousands of characters in Chinese writing.
It was an enormous advantage. You only needed a theoretical minimum of around 24 different letters. Now, in practice, his full typecase had about 290 separate compartments.
Why so many?
Well, for ligatures, 2 letters joined as one, special characters, different font sizes, punctuation, everything you needed to make the printed text look as sophisticated as a handwritten script. But managing 290 boxes was infinitely easier than managing thousands.
And finally, the ink. You're using a powerful mechanical press with metal type, so you can't use the standard medieval ink.
No, that was water-based. It would just soak the paper and smudge immediately. So Gutenberg, through a lot of experimentation, introduced an entirely new oil-based ink formula.
And that was a critical solution.
It was thicker, stickier, more durable. It adhered perfectly to the metal type and transferred cleanly onto the damp paper without soaking through. It was essential for that high-quality, crisp impression.
And we have to talk about the aesthetic quality of his early works. He wasn't just going for speed. He was aiming for beauty.
Absolutely. The 42-line Bible, printed between 1450 and 1455, is his masterpiece. It was printed on both paper and incredibly expensive vellum. He used a dense black ink, a rich typeface, and he even left spaces for illuminators to hand-add colored initials. He was trying to replicate and surpass the beauty of the manuscript tradition.
And he was already pushing the boundaries beyond just black text, even that early.
Definitely. The 42-line Bible had a trial of color printing for a few headings, but the main Psalter of 1457, which was produced by his successors, took it even further. It featured these elaborate red and blue printed initials, which required an incredibly complex double printing process to get the registration perfect. So you can see they were rapidly exploring color printing, making the press an engine for visual, not just textual, communication.
So now that we understand the breakthroughs, the type, the mold, the inklet step inside a 15th century print shop, what would a classical Gutenberg-style wooden press look like?
Well, they were surprisingly large, sturdy machines. They were typically, 5 to 7 feet long, about 3 feet wide and 7 feet tall. Big, heavy wooden frames. They had to be robust enough to withstand the incredible torque needed for that kiss of pressure.
And the workflow was an early example of specialization. It started with a compositor.
That's right. First step was typesetting. The compositor would stand at a case holding all the little metal letters. They'd arrange them backward and upside down into a handheld composing stick, line by line.
Which sounds incredibly difficult.
It was. These lines were then transferred into wooden frames called galleys. Once a full sheet's worth of text was composed, those galleys were locked into a big frame called a form, and that was placed on the flat stone bed of the press, ready for inking.
And that process demanded high literacy, immense patience, and absolute precision.
It did, and it led to the specialized role of the corrector. The corrector would proofread a printed sheet, the galley proof, before the full run began. Because composing backward was so mentally taxing, corrections were constant and critical.
Once the type was locked in, how is the ink applied?
It was a very skilled process, using two tools known as balls or pads. These were mounted on wooden handles and made of dogskin leather.
Dogskin? Why?
Specifically because it's non-porous, so it wouldn't absorb the oily ink. They were stuffed with sheep's wool to give them a springy feel. The pressman would dab these balls on the ink slab and then systematically beat the ink evenly across the type.
So it was a rhythmic, practiced motion?
Absolutely. And while the inker did that, the paper preparation was also happening. The paper was deliberately dampened.
Why damp the paper? Wouldn't that lead to tearing?
It was a delicate balance. It needed to be just damp enough to relax the fibers and let the type bite into the paper, ensuring a crisp impression without tearing.
And that damp sheet was secured onto a frame.
Onto a hinged frame called the tympan. And on top of that, you had another frame, the frisket.
Wait, what did the frisket do?
The frisket was very clever. It had holes cut out that corresponded exactly with the pages of type. So when it was folded down, it acted as a mask, preventing ink from getting on the margins of the paper.
So it kept everything clean?
Yes. They folded down together, and often a wool blanket was placed between them to form an elastic pad. This helped cushion the tremendous force of the press.
So once everything is aligned, the bed of the press has to be moved under the platen, the heavy plate that provides the pressure.
Right. And that was done by turning a small crank handle called the rounce. This would roll the heavy form into the exact position under the platen.
And then the final act, the impression, achieved by turning that long handle.
That long handle was known as the bar or the devil's tail. The pressman would grab the bar and, using immense leverage, turn the central screw that transmitted that final powerful pressure down through the platen.
It sounds like a continuous, physically punishing cycle.
It was, and that's why the labor was split. You had a two-man team. The inker, applying the ink, and the puller, who pulled the bar. Together, they could achieve 14,000 hand movements in a working day.
You can just imagine the scene. The clanking, the snap of the bar, the smell of oil ink and damp paper, the beating heart of the printing revolution.
And the genius of the system was that it was immediately reproducible. It spread like wildfire because its demand was so desperate.
Let's talk about that speed. It started in Mainz, but how quickly did it become a European phenomenon?
And the diffusion rate is truly remarkable. Starting from that single shop, printing spread to over 200 cities in a dozen European countries within just a few decades. By 1480, printers were active in 110 different places.
Wow.
The printed book was basically in universal use in Europe from that point on. The genie was out of the bottle.
And the sheer quantitative output is just mind-boggling.
By the year 1500, just 55 years after the first Bible presses in Western Europe had produced more than 20 million volumes.
20 million?
And it only accelerated. In the 16th century, output rose tenfold to an estimated 150 to 200 million copies.
And to give that some context, we have the anecdote about Erasmus. At least 750,000 copies of his work were sold during his lifetime alone. That's an intellectual celebrity phenomenon on a scale nobody had ever seen.
And this scale quickly led to a profound cultural and political earthquake. The most famous example, of course, is the Reformation.
The press was absolutely critical to its success.
Some would argue indispensable. The press turned a theological argument into a media war, and it caught the established authorities completely off guard.
How so?
The numbers are staggering. Between 1518 and 1524, book publication in Germany skyrocketed sevenfold. Martin Luther used the press brilliantly. He wrote short, sharp tracts in the vernacular that could be cheaply and rapidly distributed. Between 1518 and 1520 alone, 300,000 printed copies of his tracts were distributed.
That's faster and wider than any message had ever moved in history.
It was a shock of velocity. The Catholic Church's traditional response mechanisms, condemnation, excommunication, were designed for an age of slow, hand-copied texts. By the time Rome issued a response, Luther's next tract was already on the streets.
The establishment just couldn't keep up.
They couldn't contain it. And this unrestricted circulation of ideas is why the machine lent its name to the medium itself. We still call it the press.
And that medium became associated with the fight for political freedom, the English Civil War, the American and French revolutions.
All leveraged pamphlets and bulletins, but that power immediately led to issues of censorship and the endless battle for freedom of the press. The authorities realized very quickly that this was a weapon that needed to be controlled.
Beyond politics, this was the true democratization of knowledge in action.
The monopoly of the literate elite, the clergy, court officials, it was fundamentally broken. Knowledge was suddenly accessible and cheaper, which directly bolstered the emerging middle class. It created a self-reinforcing cycle. Cheaper books led to more literacy, which created demand for more books.
The press also solved a crucial problem that hand copying never could: consistency.
The standardization of knowledge. This is maybe the most profound intellectual consequence, because the process ensured the exact same information was on the exact same pages. Scholars could finally refer to an identical text.
And that led to things we take for granted now.
Exactly. Page numbering, tables of contents, indices, these things became common.
How did something as simple as page numbering change things in a field like law or medicine?
It created certainty. A doctor could now direct a colleague to plate 3, figure 7, page 112, knowing they were looking at the precise same image. It allowed for exact citing of references, which dramatically increased the reliability of knowledge systems.
And it created the modern concept of authorship.
It made authorship meaningful and profitable for the first time. Before the press, the author's name was often lost. But now it became critical to know exactly who had said or written what.
And this standardization didn't just affect organization, it affected language itself. Latin was still the lingua franca for scholarly work.
Latin took a massive hit. As the press democratized knowledge, it was replaced by the vernacular language of each area, because merchants and common people needed books they could actually read.
And the printed word helped unify and standardize the spelling and syntax of those vernaculars.
Absolutely. Think of English or French or German. Before the press, spelling was chaotic and regional. A printer had a financial incentive to print texts that could appeal to the largest possible market, which meant adopting a standardized vernacular. This rise of standardized national languages is directly cited as a major cause of the rise of proto-nationalism in Europe.
Culturally and politically, the shifts were immense, but the impact was also deeply economic and scientific.
The press helped bring on the scientific revolution. It created a community of scientists who could easily communicate discoveries through scholarly journals. Knowledge became cumulative and collaborative.
And economically, the data suggests printing was associated with higher levels of city growth.
Well, the publication of manuals was transformative. Books teaching techniques like double-entry bookkeeping, the foundation of modern accounting, increased the reliability of trade. This paved the way for modern global commerce. The press literally created the instruction manuals for capitalism.
But for over 300 years, the basic mechanism of the press remained fundamentally unchanged. It was limited by human muscle.
Right, until the Industrial Revolution. That's when the search for truly unprecedented speed transformed everything.
By 1800, the demands for daily newspapers and mass education made the hand-operated wooden press obsolete. The first big improvement was structural.
Correct. The wooden press had weaknesses, wood warps. So the British inventor Lord Stanhope built a press entirely from cast iron around 1800.
And that iron frame provided immense integrity.
It did. The Stanhope press reduced the required physical force by 90% and doubled the size of the printed area. So it doubled the output from 240 impressions per hour to 480. A significant leap, but still limited by human muscle.
To break that barrier, you needed two things: power that wasn't human, and continuous motion instead of stop-start.
And that takes us to the German printer Friedrich Koenig. Between 1802 and 1818, he solved both problems. He implemented steam power and, critically, he replaced the flat printing bed with the continuous motion of cylinders.
And this is where we stop talking about books for scholars and start talking about daily newspapers for everyone.
Exactly. The implications were immediate. In 1814, Koenig sold two of his first steam-powered models to the Times newspaper in London.
And what was the quantifiable leap this time?
This machine was capable of 1,100 impressions per hour, more than doubling the Stanhope press. They quickly improved it to print on both sides of a sheet at once. This was the definitive beginning of the mass audience newspaper.
That jump from 240 to 1,100 in just 2 decades is staggering. But even that wasn't fast enough. The final evolution was the full rotary press.
That came from the United States with Richard M. Hoe in 1843. Hoe abandoned the flatbed completely. He invented a press where the type was curved and mounted on a rotating cylinder, printing against another cylinder.
So the motion became continuous.
It's the ultimate mass production machine. Hoe's original design operated at up to 8,000 pages per hour.
8,000.
And by feeding paper from massive rolls instead of sheets, the speeds just became unbelievable. By 1891, state-of-the-art presses were producing 90,000 four-page sheets per hour.
Okay, let's put that entire journey into one final perspective. Hand copying. A few pages per day. The original Gutenberg press, 240 impressions per hour.
Koenig's first steam press jumped that to 1,100 impressions per hour in 1814.
And by 1891, the rotary press was achieving 90,000 four-page sheets per hour.
That is a speed increase that truly restructured human civilization.
What an incredible journey. We've seen how the press was a perfect confluence of existing technologies, perfected by Gutenberg's specific breakthroughs, the alloy, the hand mold, the oil-based ink, and this technological perfection led directly to the printing revolution. It democratized knowledge, standardized language, accelerated commerce, and provided the fuel for religious and political upheaval. It was the engine of change for the second millennium.
And that standardization, the fact that every copy was identical, is what gives us reliability. But here's the final provocative thought for you to consider. The sources mention that the printing press was immediately criticized, not just for its revolutionary potential, but also for allowing the rapid dissemination of incorrect information.
That's a powerful complication. We rely on the press for accuracy, but its speed is also what allows flaws to spread faster than ever before.
So given that the press made information standardized and ubiquitous, what impact does the ease of mass production and rapid instant circulation of standardized or potentially flawed information have on modern society, where digital printing and dissemination are not just fast, but immediate and universal?
The fundamental challenge of ensuring the accuracy of mass-produced knowledge remains, even though our press is now instantaneous. A question worth considering every time we click share.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We hope you've enjoyed this look into Gutenberg's ingenious system and the world it created.